Welcome to Charts Today Energy. My name's David Linton, and today's edition for Monday, the 29th of October, comes to you from London. And the energy mix is falling again today. We're seeing a lot of red on the screen, and if we look at global sentiment, we're seeing that negative sentiment continuing. Dollar remains strong, bullish on all three time frames. Remembering this is my long term, my weekly, my medium term, my daily, and my short term, my 60-minute. And if we look at the euro, we're seeing euro weaker against the dollar, still bearish below the cloud, and downside potential still of 1.75% to 112. Against the yen, dollar is actually a little bit bearish short term, but medium and long term still bullish. And sterling is falling against the dollar, that 128 level really coming under pressure. Again today. Against the euro, sterling looking lower as well, and we've got some downside targets. So we're seeing the recent bullishness in sterling evaporating, and the euro is dominating there. And against the Swiss franc, sterling is actually up slightly, but still bearish on all three time frames. Markets were down pretty substantially on Friday in the US. Nasdaq was down 2.3%. All the US stock markets looking lower, and we're seeing quite big falls in Europe. The UK market's up this morning, but we are seeing the German market down, political tensions there, and multiple downside targets. So we are just seeing a weakness generally across the board. Gold just holding that $1230 level. So still looking more and more bullish all the time, and US 10-year yields suffering a little bit down at 3.06%. So we're just seeing sentiment really to the downside. Looking at the energy mix, we see Brent crude sitting at $77 this morning. Really that downward track still continuing. We do have some upside targets and some downside targets, but the medium-term picture on the 60-minute chart is still bearish. 75.42 hangs over us mid-70s, although we do now have an upside target to 80. We've locked this thrust column down. If we move to new lows, that's pretty bearish for crude. And of course, we are in the weaker part of the year. With the we tend to head up to the new year weaker, so it's looking like oil could go lower, and we're seeing here WTI. We've got this downside target, $58 if we move lower, and we've also got the mid 60s hanging over us. We're at 67 at the moment. It's correlations with the dollar, negative as we'd expect. So if the dollar rises, crude falls, and we're just seeing this gradual sell-off. And this morning we're just seeing that continuing, so just drifting lower there. U.S. nat gas sitting at $3.12 has been relatively resilient. We have seen a little bit of a sell-off, and we've opened much lower today, but still holding on to those levels of 9-month highs. Looking at heating oil, downside targets here, really following crude as we might expect, and looking at RBOB, much the same. We've got it really tracking the crude price, although the correlations are not quite as clear. Looking at coal price, coal is actually still sinking lower. No clear downside targets. We've got quite a long-term one here. This is on Thomson Reuters Icon data, of course. If you're running on your Trayport data, you will have more liquidity on the coal price, so you'll have probably a better screen. The key thing is that we don't move below this low that was set a couple of weeks ago in October. If we make new lows there, that becomes the lower high and then the lower low. From a chart perspective, that would be bad news for coal, and it is looking a little bit toppy there. So we are also into medium-term bearish territory here, so that's quite key as well. Looking at emissions this morning, we're seeing emissions actually down about 1%, and we're seeing here we're sinking lower on the 60-minute chart. Really quite worrying again, just looking here, this September low looking really under pressure now. And today, we're if we close at these levels, that would be a new closing low since August. We do have these downside targets on the 60-minute chart on the of 1742, 1697, so that's some 4 and 6% lower. And we see here this morning we have just been teetering off, and of course the correlation with crude is pretty clear there, and this just seeing this move to new lows is actually quite worrying on the emissions chart. Taking a look at the 1 minute chart, we see here we do have an upside target. The downside target's 18, we're given and met. So we're just really waiting for new price action to give us new targets. MBP is up this morning, up 2/3%. So we are just seeing that little relief rally. We fell quite heavily on Friday, but we're just seeing that sort of relief rally. But again, looking very similar to a head and shoulders here. There's a shoulder, a head, and then another shoulder. So downside pressure is showing through there. We had this downside target given on the longer term chart at it was given at 72 pence per therm. We're now at 64, 69 as the target. We're nearly there, so we've moved towards that target. And looking at the 1 minute chart, again we're seeing downside targets to 62.40, 62.90. So that's 4 or 5% further downside based on that chart. Again, your Trayport charts might be producing a little bit different targets because you'll have higher liquidity on the OTC screen. TTF is also looking pretty clearly down. We're seeing here we're making lower lows not seen since August, and on the 1 minute chart again on TTF we do have these downside targets. 23.95, 23.75, 23.60, and 23.40. So anywhere between 1 and 3.5% downside potential. And the fact we've got multiple targets says that that's more likely. German gas looking lower as well, of course, and Italian gas also hitting the floor there. So we're seeing that as a theme across markets. Looking at German power, falling away quite substantially on Friday. Not looking as worrying as the gas chart, which is making new lows. Power is not yet through those low levels, but we do have this target of 47 hanging over us, which is 6% lower. On the long-term chart, which I know not many traders look at, we're at 44 and 40, so anywhere between 12 and 20% downside. But for the now, the key thing is we do have multiple downside targets: 48.60, 50.40, 49.60, and 49.80. Keep an eye on these 1 minute charts through the day for any new targets developing. Then, of course, much the same picture is true on French power. We've got downside targets there. On Nordic Power was looking like making a little bit of recovery, building a base, but we're seeing a sell-off again this morning, and we've got downside targets here as well. So that's starting to look less good than it was. UK Power, we're seeing downside targets. Dutch Power, also we're seeing downside targets. Czech Power, much the same picture, and Polish power, which was looking quite solid, is off sharply this morning, although we still do have these upside targets on Polish power. We have had a bit of a setback there today, and Italian power looking lower as well, and as is Spanish power, is obviously less liquid. That's it for today. Until tomorrow, happy charting. See you then.